In the summer of 1943, during the Sicily campaign, General George S. Patton slapped two hospitalized American soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, branding them cowards. The incident detonated into a massive scandal. Dwight D. Eisenhower quickly intervened, forcing Patton to publicly apologize to the medical staff and his troops. For a commander who believed fear could be conquered by sheer willpower, it was a humiliating lesson that physically striking a broken subordinate is viewed as a gross abuse of power, not military discipline. This public disgrace left a deep, unhealed psychological wound in his worldview, one that would be violently reopened a year later by a single sheet of paper. That paper arrived in the autumn of 1944. Patton was now commanding the Third Army, driving his forces across Europe when a disturbing court-martial file landed on his desk. It detailed the case of a 21-year-old corporal named Daniel Reeves. The charge was unambiguous and severe, filed under the Articles of War, assaulting a superior commissioned officer. The undeniable facts were laid bare on the page. There was one physical strike, a fallen officer, and a full confession from the corporal with no immediate excuses offered. Reeves faced a general court-martial, years in a military penitentiary, and a dishonorable discharge. But for Patton, this file represented a profound psychological trap. He was forced to pass judgment on a soldier who committed the exact same physical act of violence that nearly destroyed his own career. This is not a standard romanticized tale of a righteous general using his power to save a simple infantryman. It is, instead, a moral and psychological trial of Patton himself. If he allowed the court-martial to proceed, he cemented his own hypocrisy, punishing a young corporal for the very loss of control he was guilty of in Sicily. If he intervened, he placed his personal definition of justice above the law, subverting the strict chain of command he demanded from his troops. Why would a general, publicly humiliated and nearly ruined for his own violent outburst, ultimately choose to bypass military justice, destroy official documents, and protect a soldier guilty of the very same crime? The machinery of the United States Army in the autumn of 1944 was not merely a mechanism of tanks, artillery shells, and advancing infantry lines. It was a massive, relentless bureaucracy of military justice. Millions of drafted men, pulled from civilian life and thrust into the chaotic meat grinder of the European theater, were held together by a rigid, unyielding legal framework known as the Articles of War. This code was designed to impose absolute order on an inherently disorderly environment. When a violation occurred, the bureaucratic machine processed the infraction with sterile efficiency, transforming the mud, blood, and terror of the front lines into neatly typed, emotionally detached legal documents. When the file of Corporal Daniel Reeves arrived at the headquarters of the Third Army, it had already passed through this cold bureaucratic filter. The charge resting on General George S. Patton's desk was the cornerstone of military discipline, governed by Article 65, assaulting a superior commissioned officer. The divide between an enlisted man and a commissioned officer is the foundational load-bearing wall of any modern military structure.
The Army functions on the premise that an officer's command is absolute and unquestionable. To raise a hand against an officer is not just an assault on a single man, it is a physical attack on the entire chain of command, a crack in the foundation that keeps an armed force from devolving into an armed mob. It is treated as a cardinal sin, an act of insubordination that the system cannot and will not tolerate. The file sitting before Patton lacked the usual convoluted testimonies, conflicting witness statements, or desperate defensive maneuvers typical of a disputed event. There was no ambiguity for the Judge Advocate General's officers to untangle. The undeniable facts were laid bare in stark, typewritten black and white. A 21-year-old corporal, a commissioned lieutenant, a single, deliberate physical strike. The officer knocked to the ground.
There was no need for investigators to track down eyewitnesses or cross-examine members of the platoon, because Corporal Reeves had offered a full, unhesitating confession. He did not claim his weapon discharged accidentally. He did not claim he had stumbled or that the darkness had confused him. He did not offer any immediate, mitigating excuses to soften the blow of the legal hammer. He simply admitted to the violence. By confirming the facts of the assault so completely, Reeves had essentially locked his own cell door from the inside. The bureaucratic machine was now merely idling, waiting for Patton's signature to execute the inevitable. The punishment for a guilty plea in a case of this magnitude was not a simple demotion, a transfer to a different unit, or a temporary forfeiture of pay. Reeves was facing a general court-martial, the highest and most severe level of military trial. The guaranteed outcome was a sentence measured in years, to be served in a federal military penitentiary. While his generation finished fighting a global war, he would be locked behind bars, stripped of his freedom. And upon his eventual release, he would be branded with a dishonorable discharge, a permanent, indelible stain that would follow him back into civilian life, voiding his veterans' benefits and marking him forever as a man who had broken under the fundamental requirements of duty. It is necessary to acknowledge here that in the decades since the end of the Second World War, historians and researchers have debated the exact provenance of this specific file. Because the documentary trail of this incident abruptly vanishes, supposedly destroyed at the highest level of command, some argue that the tale of Corporal Reeves might be an enduring piece of frontline folklore. In this view, it is a composite narrative, a phantom case born in the muddy encampments of the European theater to express the deep, unresolvable tensions between frontline trauma and rigid rear echelon law. The varying spellings of names in post-war recollections and the absence of a surviving Judge Advocate General case file only add to this historical friction. Yet, whether viewed as a fully documented, meticulously suppressed historical event, or as a powerful, enduring military legend, the dilemma it represents is absolute. For Patton, the file was not just a legal document, it was a profound, inescapable psychological trap. The raw physical mechanics of the corporal's crime were identical to his own darkest, most shameful moment in Sicily. An angry man raising his hand against a soldier in uniform. If Patton picked up his pen, authorized the general court-martial, and allowed the system to crush the young corporal, he would be cementing his own hypocrisy. He would be declaring in official ink that rank is the ultimate shield against the consequences of violence. He would be stating that a general can slap a hospitalized, defenseless man, retain his stars, and continue to command armies, but a 21-year-old enlisted man who loses control for a single second must be stripped of his life and liberty. Sending Reeves to prison would mean confirming that Patton himself had escaped justice merely because he wore the right insignia on his collar. Yet, the alternative was equally impossible. Patton was a fanatic for discipline. This was the same commander who famously issued fines for unbuckled chin straps, missing neckties, and unpolished boots in active combat zones. He believed down to his marrow that minor infractions of uniform and protocol inevitably led to a collapse of unit cohesion under the stress of fire. He demanded strict obedience. If he intervened now, if he somehow pardoned a soldier who had violently assaulted a commissioned officer, he would be placing his personal, subjective sense of justice far above established military law. He would be signaling that the rules were flexible, that a soldier could strike an officer and survive the legal consequences if the commanding general felt a flicker of personal sympathy. That was not mercy, that was anarchy. It would shatter the very chain of command Patton had spent his life defending. The trap was set, the pen was waiting. The case was completely closed, awaiting only a signature to finalize the destruction of a young man's life. But as Patton reads past the initial charge sheet, the simple, damning narrative of insubordination begins to fracture. The rigid, clinical structure of a court-martial file is designed to answer only two questions. What was the physical action? And which specific military law did it violate? It does not concern itself with the surrounding chaos. But as the pages of the file turned, the sterile legal narrative gave way to a deeply unsettling timeline of events on the front line. The incident did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in the terrifying, high-stakes minutes preceding combat. The documents detailed the location of Corporal Reeves's platoon on the night of the assault. They were holding a forward, exposed position, heavily dug into the muddy earth, bracing against the inevitable pressure of the German lines opposite them. Command of this critical outpost rested with Lieutenant Francis Weber. As the night deepened, the tension in the forward trenches thickened. Intelligence reports and the subtle, unmistakable sounds drifting across the darkness indicated that the enemy was moving. A German probing attack, designed to test the strength of the American line, was imminent. It was in this claustrophobic environment of impending violence that the timeline fractured. The file recorded a specific moment, approximately 45 minutes before the first shots were fired, when Lieutenant Weber made a decision. He informed his senior non-commissioned officer that he was leaving the forward trench. His stated reason, logged in the reports, was that he needed to personally report the increasing enemy activity to the company commander. The command post was located approximately 800 yards to the rear, a significant distance across dark, uneven terrain. He stepped out of the trench, disappearing into the darkness behind the lines, and he never arrived at the command post. The senior sergeant waiting in the forward trench received no further orders via field telephone. There was no updated tactical plan, no confirmation of artillery support, and no explanation for the lieutenant's continued absence. The minutes bled away. The men of the platoon gripped their weapons, staring into the dark, entirely unaware that the officer responsible for orchestrating their defense, coordinating their fire, and managing their survival was no longer on the battlefield. When the German assault finally materialized out of the night, it hit an American platoon that was functionally decapitated. The men were forced to react blindly to a coordinated enemy thrust. The realization contained within the file was chilling. The assaulted officer, the man claiming the absolute protection of the Articles of War, had been entirely derelict in his fundamental duty. He had chosen self-preservation over command, slipping away into the safety of the rear and leaving his men entirely blind to what was creeping toward them in the dark. The consequence of that absence unfolded rapidly. The German infantry units moving through the dark were executing a standard reconnaissance in force. Their objective was not necessarily to break the American line permanently, but to test its structural integrity, to gauge the speed and coordination of the American response. They approached the entrenched positions anticipating the usual defensive reaction. A unified wall of suppressing fire, immediate calls for artillery illumination, and the distinct, organized pushback of a well-commanded unit. Instead, as they closed the distance and engaged the American perimeter, the German attackers immediately sensed a tactical vulnerability. The resistance they met was furious but disjointed. The American fire was concentrated in some sectors but dangerously sparse in others, lacking the sweeping, overlapping fields of fire that an officer would typically orchestrate to seal a perimeter. The enemy recognized the hesitation, the unmistakable signature of a unit fighting without central direction. Exploiting this sudden gap in coordination, the German forces pressed their advantage, applying lethal pressure to the weakest points of the leaderless American line. Inside that American perimeter, the reality of their situation plunged the platoon into total tactical confusion. The sudden eruption of combat in the dark is disorienting under the best circumstances, but a platoon relies on its officer to act as the central nervous system during a firefight. The officer dictates where the heavy weapons are deployed, when to shift fire to counter a flanking maneuver, and, most crucially, when to hold the line and when to fall back. Without Lieutenant Weber, the American soldiers were isolated in their individual fighting holes, fighting private, desperate battles against an enemy they could barely see. The senior non-commissioned officers shouted commands, attempting to establish a unified defense, but the broader tactical picture was lost. There was no one to coordinate with neighboring units, no one to adjust the defensive geometry as the German probing attack found the seams in their line. The platoon was paralyzed by a lack of coordinated command, forced to absorb the full, concentrated force of the German assault, while functionally blind to the larger battle. The cost of that paralysis was extracted in American lives. The chaotic, uncoordinated defense allowed the German forces to inflict casualties that a properly managed perimeter might have prevented. The firefight was brief, violent, and ultimately repelled, but the damage was irreversible. 3 young American soldiers were killed in the confusion. They did not die in a massive, unavoidable artillery barrage or a sweeping offensive operation. They died in a disorganized skirmish, their deaths directly linked to the operational vacuum left by their commanding officer. The loss of 3 men in a single engagement is a tragedy, but in the grinding attrition of the European theater, it was an everyday reality. What transformed this specific loss into the catalyst for a court-martial was the identity of the dead. Among those 3 young soldiers killed in the chaotic defense was Corporal Daniel Reeves's closest friend. The file did not need to elaborate on the depth of their bond. The shared history of soldiers who enlist together is universally understood. They were 2 boys who had likely walked into the recruiting office on the same day, endured the physical and psychological stripping of basic training side by side, crossed the Atlantic on the same troop ship, and survived the terrifying reality of combat by relying entirely on each other. The death of a comrade is a crushing blow, but Reeves was forced to process this loss with the agonizing knowledge that his friend's death was not merely an unavoidable hazard of war. His friend had died in a disorganized, panicked firefight because the man responsible for their tactical survival had abandoned his post. Reeves had not struck an officer over a petty dispute or a harsh command. He had struck the man who, through an act of cowardly self-preservation, had functionally orchestrated the death of his best friend. As Patton absorbed the true, devastating context of the assault, the file revealed a final, damning piece of information that transformed the incident from a tragic, isolated failure of leadership into a systemic, institutional failure. Buried deeper in the paperwork were records of previous complaints lodged against Lieutenant Weber. Two different sergeants, seasoned, non-commissioned officers who understood the brutal arithmetic of combat, had previously attempted to raise the alarm regarding the lieutenant's behavior under fire. They had formally reported his unreliability, noting his tendency to falter or disappear when the pressure of combat escalated. These were not the complaints of disgruntled recruits. They were the urgent warnings of veteran sergeants trying to protect their men from a dangerous liability. Yet the Army's bureaucratic machinery, the same machinery currently preparing to imprison Corporal Reeves, had ignored those warnings. The system designed to enforce discipline and ensure the competence of its officers had failed to investigate the sergeant's claims. It had swept the danger under the rug, prioritizing the protection of a commissioned officer's reputation over the safety of the enlisted men under his command. Weber had been allowed to retain his command, and that administrative failure had now resulted in 3 dead Americans. The document on Patton's desk was no longer just a charge sheet against a grieving corporal. It was a glaring indictment of an institutional system that actively shielded a coward while methodically preparing to destroy the soldier who finally held him accountable. As the full weight of the institutional failure settled over the paperwork, the file ceased to be a simple legal review. For General George S. Patton, the typewritten pages had transformed into a punishing moral mirror. The entire case now hinged on a profound, inescapable contrast between 2 distinct acts of illegal violence. Under the strict, unyielding letter of the Articles of War, the violence committed in the evacuation hospitals of Sicily in 1943 and the violence committed in the muddy trenches of 1944 were legally identical. Both men had allowed their emotions to shatter the absolute boundaries of military discipline. Both had crossed the line into physical assault. But beyond the sterile confines of military law, the direction of power, the underlying motives, and the ultimate moral weight of their actions were exact, terrifying opposites. When Patton lost control, he had struck downward. Wielding the supreme authority of a commanding general, he had raised his hand against enlisted men who were hospitalized, suffering from psychiatric collapse, and completely dependent on the military medical system for their survival. He hit them out of a visceral, ideological contempt for what he perceived as cowardice. He had used the immense, unchecked weight of his rank to physically humiliate the powerless. Corporal Daniel Reeves had done the exact opposite. He had struck upward. A 21-year-old enlisted man, occupying the lowest rungs of the tactical ladder, had raised his hand against a commissioned officer, a man who held absolute authority over his life and liberty. Reeves did not strike out of arrogance, entitlement, or a breakdown of courage.
He struck out of a blinding, agonizing grief. He hit the lieutenant because he possessed the absolute, devastating conviction that his commander had chosen self-preservation over duty, leaving his men to be slaughtered in the dark. The psychological trap around Patton was now fully closed. The military justice system demanded that Reeves be destroyed for his insubordination. But to sign the general court-martial order was to endorse a grotesque legal hypocrisy.
It meant legally cementing a reality where a general could strike a traumatized patient and keep his army, while a grieving corporal who struck a fleeing coward must be locked in a federal penitentiary. Sitting alone in his headquarters, with the pen resting quietly beside the charge sheet, Patton was no longer just deciding the fate of a broken infantryman. He had been forced into the agonizing position of acting as the judge of his own unhealed past. The agonizing climax of this internal trial did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in the quiet isolation of a command tent. General George S. Patton, a man whose entire career was built on the rigid enforcement of military discipline, stared down at the paperwork that would destroy Daniel Reeves. He had to decide if a strict, unyielding law that entirely ignores context could be allowed to completely invert moral reality.
If he signed the order for the general court-martial, he would be utilizing the full weight of the United States Army to imprison a grieving 21-year-old soldier. He would be locking away a corporal whose only real crime was holding a superior accountable for a deadly failure of leadership. And by allowing that prosecution to move forward, Patton would guarantee that Lieutenant Weber, the officer whose cowardice under fire had directly caused the deaths of 3 American soldiers, remained protected by the very system he had abused. The conflict was absolute. On one side was the strict written law of the Articles of War, demanding that any physical assault on a commissioned officer be met with severe, unhesitating punishment to maintain the integrity of the chain of command. On the other side was Patton's personal, uncompromising sense of frontline justice, forged through decades of command and deeply scarred by his own public failures.
He knew that military law was designed to maintain order, but in this specific instance, enforcing the law would execute a profound injustice. In a decisive, deeply controversial move that subverted the entire military justice bureaucracy, Patton made his choice. He reached for the court-martial documents, the undeniable confession, the formal charges, the meticulously typed evidence, and he physically tore them apart. By destroying the file, Patton bypassed the Judge Advocate General's office, erased the official record of the assault, and single-handedly dismantled the prosecution against the corporal. With the tearing of that paper, the official case against Daniel Reeves ceased to exist. But the heavy, lasting consequences of that bureaucratic silence remained. Following the destruction of the evidence, Corporal Daniel Reeves was quietly returned to his unit. He was permitted to finish the war as a combat soldier rather than a federal inmate. Meanwhile, the operational failures of Lieutenant Weber quietly became the subject of a separate, distinctly unpublicized inquiry, safely removed from the explosive context of a subordinate's physical assault. But the eradication of those documents cannot be neatly framed as a triumphant, cinematic victory of frontline justice over cold rear echelon bureaucracy. By erasing the file, Patton certainly prevented a morally abhorrent sentence from destroying a grieving young man. Yet, in doing exactly that, he established a profoundly dangerous precedent. The entire apparatus of military law, the rigid system deliberately designed to ensure objective fairness, establish a verifiable record of events, and hold all ranks legally accountable, was unilaterally bypassed. The tension of this incident lies in the highly uncomfortable space between doing what is morally right and deliberately breaking the foundation of an institution to achieve it. Patton did not reform the flawed procedure that had previously protected a negligent officer. He simply used his supreme authority to make the immediate bureaucratic problem disappear. He replaced the codified rule of military law with the unchecked, arbitrary will of a single commanding general. Because Patton never formally recorded his reasoning, his true internal motives remain forever locked in the autumn of 1944.
We cannot know definitively if tearing up that file was a rare moment of genuine moral reckoning, a conscious attempt to correct the hypocrisy of his own violent past, or simply an act of ruthless military pragmatism by a commander who needed his men focused on the enemy, not a courtroom. This hidden act of mercy leaves behind a deeply unsettling reality about the nature of military authority. The ultimate historical question is no longer whether the young corporal deserved to be saved from a prison cell. The question is what Patton actually learned from his own humiliating public disgrace in the hospitals of Sicily. Had the general finally recognized the vital difference between sheer force and true justice?
Or had he simply concluded that the right to shatter the rules belongs exclusively to the man who holds the most power?